guys, it's Caroline Grace, and today my first book, The Academy Year 1, is available for pre-order. The link for that will be down below. But today I'm also going to be reading the first chapter of The Academy Year 1 for you guys, and I'm so excited. I hope you enjoy, and leave any comments down below. Thank you guys.
Prologue. In a tiny house nestled between the sea and the sky, a young woman sat. The woman had no name, yet everyone knew of her. She was known as many things: the bringer of destruction, the apocalypse conductor, the host, and countless others. For you see, she had predicted the apocalypse. Her vision had been of the gods falling through the sky, leaving giant craters in their wake and monsters free to roam the world. The oracle knew she had to do something. But what could be done? 248 days. Iz looked out the window of the bus, the bright sun the opposite of how she felt. She had just left her family, all of them had, potentially for the last time. And yet there was the sun. It felt like the weather was mocking her sour mood. The sky was a beautiful blue, the grassy fields were dancing in the breeze, and the trees were just starting to lose their leaves. Children were playing outside, laughter filling the fields, until they saw the bus. Everyone knew of the bus. Iz had grown up hearing tales of the bus and reading up on conspiracy theories of what happened at the academy. Many people were convinced the government killed you and replaced you with clones at the academy, but Iz was less inclined to believe that theory. After all, the academy had been around since the beginning of time, and cloning had only just been discovered. All anyone knew for sure about the academy was that it opened up every 100 years, and every 13-year-old was required to go when it opened. Nobody knew what happened at the academy, yet every year that the academy was open, some people came back. Everyone talked about the people who came back. They were always slightly off, and they rarely remembered their parents or close friends. As a kid, all of Iz's friends had debated about which would be better, never coming back or coming back different. Iz had grown up hearing stories about the academy. It was all anyone ever seemed to talk about, all anyone around her growing up seemed to care about, and the academy was featured in the horror stories told around campfires. She was hoping the stories were just exaggerated myths to keep kids in line, but the night before she had left, she had overheard her parents talking about her great-aunt Molly, who had gone to the academy and never come back. Iz squeezed her brown eyes shut. She just wanted to be back with her family. Not on this bus, not with these people, and not all alone. She had no friends here, no family. Her fingers were shaking, her eyes blurry with unshed tears. The beauty of the day was only adding to her nerves. She should be outside, playing with her little sister, the sun dancing off their darker skin as their mother tried to force them to put sunscreen on. Not on this bus, driving to quite possibly her doom. She clenched her fists tightly, attempting to stop herself from shaking, but to no avail. The bus continued to drive, Iz letting the rhythmic turning of the tires calm her slightly as they drove through the suburb, the houses of Iz's neighbors practically sparkling in the sun as blinds snapped shut and kids raced inside. They slowly began to make their way closer and closer to the city, and Iz spared a second to think about her friend Evie, who had moved a couple of years ago after getting a scholarship to a super advanced school. They had tried to keep in contact, but it just wasn't the same. Iz continued to stare out the window as the bright yellow school bus slowly pulled up to a house she recognized. Iz shook herself out of her thoughts as Evie walked out of the house. She wore a black skirt and white turtleneck with her long blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, her pale skin glowing in the sunlight. She boarded the bus and almost immediately made eye contact with Iz. A huge grin broke out on her face, her green eyes glittering behind her glasses as she raced down the aisle to sit with Iz. Evie usually wore contacts, but Iz assumed she either hadn't had time to put them in this morning, or she hadn't wanted to forget her glasses. "Hey!" Evie shouted, pulling Iz into a tight hug. Iz grinned back, wrapping her best friend in a tight hug. She didn't think the two of them would be on the same bus, but here Evie was, and she always knew how to calm Iz down. Out of the hundreds of buses which carried students to the academy, Iz was beyond thankful that the two wound up on the same bus, despite living almost half an hour away from each other. Iz slowly pulled away from the hug, the grin she now wore never dropping. She tucked a piece of her curly black hair back behind her ear, where it had escaped the tight braids her mother had done this morning before Iz left the house. She tapped her sneaker-clad foot, glancing down self-consciously at her jeans and sweatshirt, before back up at Evie's outfit, reminding herself that Evie always overdressed for wherever they were going. "Are you excited?" Evie asked, practically bouncing up and down in her seat. I'm more nervous than excited. Iz tugged at the sleeves of her sweatshirt as she spoke, pulling them over her hands. I know, but imagine what we could learn, and we're finally going to find out what happens at the academy, Evie cried, throwing her hands out, and Iz giggled. Of course Evie was excited about what they could learn. What's up, Evie? A voice shouted, and Iz looked up to find Jack grinning down at them. Jack was a jerk from the grade above them who thought he was better than everybody else, just for skipping a grade. Go away, Jack, Evie sighed, rolling her eyes at him. Do you guys have room in your seat for me? He asked, and Evie pulled her backpack off her lap and set it next to her. No, she snapped, and Jack pursed his lips. Come on, Ev, he shouted, and Evie shot to her feet, grabbing a hold of the front of his shirt. Don't ever call me that again, she snarled, and Jack's eyes widened. Iz was not envious of his position. Evie could be terrifying when she wanted to be. Everyone sit down back there, the bus driver called, and Iz grabbed Evie's arm, pulling her back into the seat. Remember in 5th grade when everyone was really beginning to talk about the academy? We got to walk around the outside where we could only imagine what went on inside with our class, and Jack took it upon himself to figure out what went on in there, so nobody would be scared because we would know what happened, Evie whispered, pulling her bag back onto her lap. Yeah, and he got caught almost instantly and was suspended for a month, Iz said with a small chuckle. And everyone in our class protested and tried to get the school to lift the suspension because he had only broken into the academy to know what went on there because he didn't want any of us to be scared. Then they discovered that he had been responsible for the graffiti all over the academy, and everyone stopped the Save Jack campaign. Iz grinned at Evie. Except for you. You insisted that his suspension be lessened because he was just trying to protect us. And it worked. You got a suspension lifted 2 weeks early. Iz grinned at her friend, knowing that once Evie set her mind to something, she would achieve it. I know, one of my proudest moments, petitioning the school and arguing with the principal, Evie said with a small laugh, and Iz smiled. I wish you had stayed. I know, I do too, but the new school is a great opportunity for your future, Evie, Evie said, mocking the words her parents had thrown at her when Evie had protested moving and going to a new school. I'm not leaving again. Promise. Well, whatever happens in the academy, I know I have you to stick up for me again, Iz whispered, and Evie pulled her in for a tight hug. The two had managed to mostly keep up their friendship through text and occasional visits, and Iz was glad to find them falling back into the same friendship they had had before Evie had moved. I will always protect you, Evie whispered before abruptly pulling away. Iz, look! She shouted, pointing out the window. Iz looked out the window of the bus as it pulled up to a large building. A number of other buses already there. The building was smaller than she remembered it, but it looked like it could be a building right from a fantasy book. It was built of brick, and Iz remembered being told that it was built shortly after the Revolutionary War was won. The building looked like it would barely fit all of the students pouring out of the buses around Iz, and she frowned. How were they going to go to classes there? She began to feel the first traces of complete panic, and squeezed her fists tighter. Evie noticed and tapped Iz's hands. Evie always tapped Iz's hands whenever Iz was squeezing them too tight or was picking at her nails, and Iz would stop. She offered a small smile to Evie before trying to steady her breathing. She was focused on keeping her hands completely open, but thoughts were still rushing around in her mind. Why was this happening to her? She felt the panic begin to fully overwhelm her, and she focused back on her breathing. The steady beat of the music the bus driver was playing overhead was helping to calm her breathing. She focused on the beat of the music and jumped when the doors opened with a swoosh. She slowly stood up, grabbing her backpack off the ground. Everyone had been instructed to bring something sentimental or irreplaceable that would fit between a backpack and a small suitcase. Everything else they would receive at the academy. As she left the bus, her breathing began to steady out even more, and she told herself she was just being ridiculous. This was nothing to freak out about. Nobody else was panicking. It was stupid to panic. Iz walked with the rest of the students before coming to a halt in front of a pair of huge brown doors. Her bag felt like 1,000,000 pounds on her back, and her breathing had begun to speed up again. Evie offered her a smile, and Iz did her best to return it. Iz regretted packing everything she had in her bag, but her mom had insisted on her bringing letters from everyone in their family, her favorite books, and a bunch of gifts from her family. She had packed some of her clothes and a few more items of sentimental value her mom insisted on inside a small suitcase. The bus driver had told her to leave it at the front of the bus, but it wasn't there when Iz got off. Iz gasped as the grand doors of the academy were thrown open, revealing a crowd of adults standing and waving at the students. Everything was beginning to blur together in Iz's vision, and tears were beginning to fall. She had never been away from home before for more than a night or two, and on top of that, Molly had gone missing and never come back. Iz felt herself freeze. The breath knocked from her lungs as they approached the wooden doors. She could do this. She had to be able to do this. And then she felt someone grab her hand, and warmth filled her. Iz looked up to find Evie, and she smiled. Evie began to pull her towards the building again. "How are you not scared?" Iz hissed, and Evie smiled at her. "Oh, trust me, I'm terrified." Evie dove back into the throng of students, tugging on Iz's arm to make sure the two stayed together as students began to enter the building. Iz took no notice of the huge doors ahead of her and Evie, even as they walked through them, or the hundreds of students going in the same direction. Then the students stopped, and Iz glanced around, her panic beginning to recede. She began to look around at the students that were standing near her to see if she recognized anyone from school, and found herself standing next to Adrian. Adrian was here! Iz hadn't realized he'd be at the academy. She'd nearly forgotten about the boy she lived with for a few years, before he and his mom had moved out. Alongside Iz's little sister Autumn, the three of them had been practically inseparable from birth through the age of 7. Autumn was only a year younger than Iz, which made it especially hard to leave her behind. But Iz was thrilled he was here. The two hadn't spoken in years, and she missed him. She reached out and tapped him on the shoulder. He turned, a huge grin spread across his face, and he immediately pulled Iz in for a tight hug. Iz dropped Evie's hand so she could wrap both arms around him, and she felt tears begin to gather in her eyes. "I'm so glad you're here. I missed you," Adrian said, and Iz nodded against his shoulder. "I missed you too," Iz whispered, and Adrian pulled away, still grinning, and gestured to the guy beside him. "This is," Adrian started, before someone clearing their throat into a microphone stopped him. Everyone in the auditorium immediately stopped talking, and Iz took the moment of silence to study the boy beside Adrian. The boy wore skinny black jeans and a gray t-shirt, and his brown hair was pushed up in the front. "Attention, please," a woman's voice called out. "May I please have your attention?" She smiled as the teens who had started talking again stopped, and the auditorium once again grew silent. Her voice echoed around the room, which was significantly larger than it appeared from the outside. Huge stained glass windows covered the walls, and they looked exactly like the windows from the old church near Iz's house, the one depicting images from religious texts that Iz's sister had been obsessed with. Iz didn't remember seeing the windows from outside, but in her panic she easily could have missed them. The people in the images looked so real, as though they could just step out of the portraits and blend in with the crowd of teenagers, despite the majority of them appearing in their early 20s. Almost all of the people in the windows wore fancy attire. The one closest to Iz was in a long, white, flowing dress, one that a bride might wear on her wedding day. The only thing ruining the woman's bride-like appearance was the long, bright red cuts running from her shoulder to her wrist. The cut looked raw, as though it had just occurred, and suddenly the pictures didn't seem so beautiful anymore. They were intimidating, almost scary, towering over the students with strict expressions on their face. Many of the people also had gashes or wounds somewhere. Some looked fresh, while others looked years old. Iz looked away from the portraits and back to the woman on the stage. She was pretty, with long brown hair tied back in a braid and a deep blue dress that reminded Iz of the moon. The dark color looked beautiful against the woman's sun-kissed skin, and she looked like she could be a student herself. She seemed so young. And then she began to speak. Her voice was light, and yet at the same time held power and confidence. "Thank you. I am sure you all have many questions about why you are here, so allow me to introduce you to your principal, Mrs. Ayers." An older woman stepped up to the stage, her long gray hair tied up in a bun that was beginning to fall out. She smiled out at the students, and Iz noticed what appeared to be knives of some sort glittering by her waist. "Hello," the woman's booming voice carried across the hall, deep and captivating. "Welcome to the academy. I know you all grew up with stories of this school, but none of you know the true reason for its existence. Through your studies here you will find out more, but for now I will tell you the short story. Many centuries ago it was discovered that the gods and goddesses of ancient religions couldn't handle one body for more than 100 years. The power was simply too much for anybody to hold for too long. Hence the academy. It was foretold by an oracle that without this school the world would dissolve into chaos. Some of you may become the only thing standing between good and evil." Mrs. Ayers paused as the students around her perked up. "So the academy was founded. Here we work with the gods and goddesses to find new people to take their place at the end of their 100 years. You will compete with one another for these positions. Every year some of you will not make it. By your 4th year, you will all be picked by a god or goddess. Those of you who make it to your 6th, the final year, will be guaranteed a spot as a deity, a teacher at the academy, or some other job in the city. Plus, in addition to this, as I'm sure many of you have noticed, the building is way larger than it looked on the outside. This is due to the fact that we are on a different planet." Some of you may have felt a bit sick as you walked through the doors, but many of you probably noticed nothing, as the transport to this planet is fairly seamless. Mrs. Ayres paused again as everyone began to murmur. Iz began to feel the panic beginning to bubble back up as she looked around her. She wasn't on Earth. She didn't know where she was. She shook her head. This had to be fake. There was no way they were on a different planet. The building you just entered from was on Earth and took you to the Academy, which is a planet just outside of the Milky Way. Our planet was founded by ancient sorcerers who realized that continuing on our education system on Earth was not possible while avoiding detections from humans as the population of Earth grew. Mrs. Ayres continued, and Iz took a deep breath, trying once again to curb her growing panic. She would be fine. They probably weren't on Earth anymore, but whatever. She would be fine. Everything would be fine. It had to be. Thank you. Now you may go pick rooms, and your schedule will be delivered shortly. As per school policy, girls and boys must room separately. However, dorms are co-ed, and teachers will be along the way to help you and pass out keys. Dorms are made for between 4 and 6 people. Your dorm will adjust based on how many of you want to live there. We will know if you break any rules. Mrs. Ayres winked at them, and Iz furrowed her brows. How could she see the principal's face from so far away? Magic. Someone seemed to whisper in her ear, and Iz turned to try and find whoever had talked, but everyone around her was listening to the principal in rapt silence. The voice had also been feminine, and the only people close enough to have whispered were Adrian and Evie never talked while a teacher was talking. Iz shook her head and turned back to Mrs. Ayres. Also, each dorm room of students will have an academy graduate assigned to help you out with any problems that may arise or any questions you may have. Mrs. Ayres then raised her arms, and the doors flew open, releasing the hundreds of students to pick their dorms. Iz felt the crowd surge forward, and she reached out, grabbing both Adrian and Evie's arms. Evie weaved between groups of other students, keeping Iz's hand clutched tightly in her own. Iz glanced behind her, Adrian and the other boy clinging to each other and to her. The crowd narrowed to go through the doors, and Iz felt elbows and bags pressing in around her. Her arms were being pulled in 2 different directions by Adrian and Evie. And then the group was through the doors and staring out over a huge city. Wow, Adrian breathed out from beside Iz. Iz could only nod in response. The huge, towering buildings surrounding them made her feel tiny. The city reminded Iz of New York City, which she had visited once with her mom when she was younger. The only difference was that littered the streets, and there were almost no cars anywhere. All the adults milling around were smiling at the group of teens. The building opposite the door Iz and her friends had come through also opened, and even more teens came pouring out. A guy standing behind Iz was talking to his friend, and she couldn't help but overhear. You know how there is a school in each country? He paused, and Iz assumed whoever he was talking to nodded. Well, all of us live in the city, regardless of where they are from. What about language differences? A different guy asked, and the first guy responded. We all have some sort of language translator thing. We hear everyone speaking in Spanish because that's the language we're most comfortable with. That's so cool. Iz smiled slightly as she looked around her, recognizing several faces from school as well as a bunch of new ones. She would have fun here. Hopefully. Where are we supposed to go? Adrian's friend asked the group, and Iz shrugged. No idea, Evie responded. Let's just follow the crowd. Iz looked back at the other people around her, only to see the group of adults spreading out to direct them. Evie grabbed Iz's hand again and began pulling, leaving Iz scrambling to grab Adrian and keep up with Evie's fast pace. Hello, are you 4 rooming together? The girl who introduced Miss Ayres asked. She looked to be around 15, and Iz was sure she had to be a student or living in the city. Maybe she was Mrs. Ayres' daughter. I'm Rona, and I'm going to be one of your teachers this year. Iz squeezed her eyes shut. What? Hi, and yes, we will be rooming together, Adrian's friend jumped in. Where are we supposed to be going? You 4 can take dorm 330. Rona handed Evie a key and pointed to the building behind her. Head up to the 3rd floor and then follow the signs to 330. I will send a graduate up soon to help you guys adjust to life here and answer any questions you lot have. Also, there will be keys for the rest of you in the room. Thank you, Evie called, pulling the group to the building Rona had assigned them. An elevator nearby opened, and Evie yanked them into it. This school is so cool, Adrian's friend shouted as soon as the door was shut. Adrian rolled his eyes at the other boy, and Evie just laughed. So what's your name? Iz asked, gesturing to the guy. Oh, I'm so sorry, my name is Dean. He spoke with an extravagant bow, and a hand extended to Iz. She laughed, and he straightened up with a smile. I'm Iz, and this is Evie, Iz responded with her own smile. Dean grinned back at her before gesturing to Adrian. This, my dear ladies, is Adrian. Adrian rolled his eyes at Dean, and then smiled at them. "So how do you two know each other?" Evie asked, pointing between Iz and Adrian. "I met Iz through our moms. They were best friends in college," Adrian said, gesturing to Iz as he spoke. "I met Dean a few years ago. His family used to travel a lot, and the year they lived near us, we became friends, and we were good friends with a guy named Joseph, too. I wonder what happened." Adrian slowly trailed off, his gaze focused on the wall behind them, and his eyes squinted. Iz was about to ask about Joseph when the group was interrupted by the elevator's opening to show a long hallway covered in flowery carpeting. There were a couple of doors on either side of the hallway, like a hotel, but Iz was only looking for 330. The doors were way closer than seemed possible, but Iz reminded herself that they were on a different planet, and they seemed to have arrived here via magic, so really, anything was possible. Room 330 turned out to be the first door on the left. Evie opened it with the key she had been given. "This is so cool," Adrian whispered. "It is," Evie replied, both stepping into the room, allowing Iz to see what they were talking about. The room they had walked into was evidently a living room, the walls a light blue, with an archway to a kitchen to their right. The hallway continued on to show a door at the end, and one on either side of the hallway. Iz turned her attention to the living room, which had 3 brown couches surrounding a really nice-looking TV that was mounted on the wall. There was also a coffee table in the middle and a huge bookshelf against the back wall. Iz jumped as Dean let the door shut behind him. "Let's explore," he said, already heading towards the kitchen. Iz looked over at Evie and Adrian, who were just standing there and looking around at the dorm they were going to be living in. A knock on the door startled everyone out of their thoughts, and Iz watched as Adrian walked over to open the door, revealing another brunette boy standing there with a man. "Hi," the guy smiled at Adrian. "Hey," Adrian responded with a grin. "Joseph?" Dean shouted, before rushing from the kitchen to envelop both boys in a hug. "Do you need somewhere to stay?" Evie wondered as Dean let go of the other boys. "Yeah," Joseph said with a small blush. "Cool, come on in," Iz spoke, glancing back at Evie to find her smiling. "So, who are you, and why do you have nobody else to stay with?" Evie questioned Joseph. "I actually grew up here," Joseph spoke softly, pushing his glasses up with a finger. "My mother wanted me to be eligible to take part in the academy like my brothers, but I was born slightly too late, and I would have been too young." He pointed to the man beside him. "So she got approval from the government to take me to Earth for a year. That's how I met Dean and Adrian. It was actually right after my mom and I moved away. My mom wanted somewhere more rural, so we left and moved a couple of hours away. And then boom, 2 new friends are my neighbors," Adrian said with a chuckle. "Wow, Joseph, that's so cool. Way more interesting than your 'I'm from England' lie." "And Adrian, I had no idea that you had just moved," Dean shouted, bouncing on the balls of his feet, a huge smile on his face, and Iz smiled. "A series of crazy coincidences," Iz whispered, Adrian laughing lightly before they turned back to Joseph. "Yeah, I guess. My mom's actions didn't earn me many friends, though," Joseph said, slowly trailing off, leaving an awkward silence throughout the room. Iz had no idea what to say, so she looked at Evie, who also looked to be struggling with coming up with something to say. "We can be your friends now," Adrian said softly, a hand on Joseph's shoulder comfortingly. "Well, clearly you guys are settled fine. Joseph knows everything. I'm out," Joseph's brother said, turning on his heel to walk away. "That was Jackson, my oldest brother. He was probably the most annoyed at my mother for her actions. He was really bitter that he didn't become a major god, but I have the chance to," Joseph said, pushing his glasses up his nose. The group stood there in awkward silence for a couple of moments, all of them realizing that this was their life from now on. "Why don't we set up our rooms and then meet up back for dinner and see what we were supposed to do?" Evie suggested, breaking the silence. "What about our suitcases?" Iz asked, suddenly remembering the meager possessions she had packed for her new school year. "They should show up at our door shortly. We just need to wait." Joseph spoke quietly again, pushing his glasses back up his nose. "Hey, you know what I just realized? Dean is way taller than you," Adrian shouted, giving Dean a high five as he did so. "Hey, you're one to talk," Joseph shot back, a smile slowly finding its way onto his face. "Is this like some long-standing argument you guys have? Because I'm taller than all of you," Evie said, a joking tone to her voice as she interrupted the boys' banter. "Yeah, sorry, it was always a joke how much shorter Dean was than both of us, and now he's taller than me," Adrian said, as Dean shot a glare at him. The group was interrupted by another knock on the door, and this time Evie ran over to answer, revealing all their luggage, but no person. "I guess we better pick rooms so we have somewhere to unpack," Iz said, glancing over to the 3 doors at the end of the hallway. "Well, then I call this room," Dean shouted, pointing to the room on the left. "We get this one," Evie shouted, grabbing her luggage and Iz, who was clutching her suitcase handle, and yanked her into the door on the right, leaving the boys to sort out their rooming situation. Iz was betting on Joseph staying by himself, and Adrian winding up rooming with Dean. Ace looked around to find the room was a deep purple with 2 beds, some sort of fitness machine, and 2 desks. Evie ran over to the bed with the deep green bedding and jumped on it. "Mine!" She smirked towards Iz. Iz rolled her eyes before sitting on her other bed, which was teal. Iz looked around her again, the hopelessness of the situation setting in once more. Her sister would have loved it here. Iz missed her house. She missed her family. She had no idea how she wound up in this mess, or with Evie, her best friend from elementary school. Iz was homesick already. "You okay?" Evie asked with a small glance toward her friend, who had spent the last couple of minutes staring off into space. Evie's closet was almost fully stuffed with the clothes she had brought, that she had been hanging up. Evie had decided to stuff her suitcase with clothes and her backpack with pictures and letters from her family. "Let's go see how the boys have worked out their rooming arrangements." Iz glanced at Evie's worried face as she gestured to the door. She hated seeing anyone worried about her. The 2 girls walked out to find the 3 guys clustered around the coffee table looking at something. "What's happening?" Iz questioned. Adrian jumped, startled, and banged his knee on the table in front of him. He shot Iz an annoyed look while Joseph held up a piece of paper. "We get to pick our classes." Joseph spoke quietly, pushing his glasses up as he did so. "Cool, let's look at the class list, Iz." Evie snatched the sheet from Joseph's hands and held it up for Iz to see. "This school seems almost too awesome!" Dean shouted, laughing as Adrian rolled his eyes at him. "We get to pick our classes," Joseph repeated softly again, reading off another sheet he had picked up. Evie grabbed the new sheet from Joseph and began to read through it. "Sweet, so we can pick classes together?" Dean spoke, grabbing the list from Evie and handing it back to Joseph. "No, we pick the classes we want to take, and then, if possible, we are paired with our roommates," Joseph said, once again readjusting his glasses. "Cool," Adrian smiled. "I can't wait to see if we wind up in any classes together." Let's pick then, Evie said. "Are you already planning your celebration for straight A's?" Iz asked, falling right back into old patterns with her friend. Evie muttered something under her breath that Iz assumed was sarcastic before grabbing the class sheet back from Joseph. "I'll take that," she smiled, scanning through the class list. "I'm so taking all of these," she whispered, always the overachiever. "We can only take 9 classes, with lunch included, unless we talk to a counselor beforehand," Joseph said, reading off yet another sheet. "Nerds," Dean said under his breath, smiling. Evie was too preoccupied staring at the list to notice, but Joseph had turned red. "Can we just start picking our classes?" Iz asked, stressed beyond belief, and wiped out from her earlier panic. "Let's do it," Joseph smiled, handing sheets out to all of them to put down what classes they wanted. They would have 9 periods a day, and they were required to take classes like core and mythology. Iz grinned down at the sheet when she saw that there was an elective drawing class. She loved drawing. "Wait, so are we really on an alien planet?" Adrian interrupted, and Iz glanced up from the list of classes to watch the conversation. "Yeah, the academy and the city are not on Earth, and there are rather limited ways to get here," Joseph responded, pressing his lips together and ducking his head a little bit as he smiled at Adrian. "Any other questions?" "How can they bring people from all over the world who speak all different languages?" Evie asked, leaning forward to catch Joseph's answer. He spoke quietly, and Iz could practically feel the anxiety radiating off of him. His hair fell slightly in his eyes, some of it slipping under his glasses, causing him to shake his head. "Well, the academy has a magical system that runs throughout it, and everyone who comes here is automatically hooked into it. It makes sure that we can all understand each other, regardless of what language we speak." "That's dope, but what about, if we get kicked out or something? What happens then?" Dean asked, and Joseph tensed slightly. "If you don't make it to the next year, then you get your memory erased, and you get sent back to Earth." "But what about you? You grew up here," Evie asked, tilting her head as she stared at Joseph. "Well, I wouldn't get my memory erased or anything, but I would go back to my family, and they probably would be pretty disappointed in me, especially considering all the extra trouble they went to make sure I could be here this year." Joseph pushed his glasses up. "But right now we should probably just pick classes." Iz watched Joseph turn back to the schedule, hunching in even further on himself, and Iz realized they must have hit a sensitive spot. Adrian shifted in his seat to press his leg against Joseph, glaring at Evie as she opened her mouth to speak and shaking his head at her. Iz turned back to her paper, deciding to just focus on her classes. Adrian and Dean knew Joseph best, after all.